Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your support and your blessings and protection on people who are working to fight the fires in California, as well as the people who are dealing with the storms and the aftermath on the East Coast. For these intentions, we pray to the Lord. Alrighty. In 1740, Pope Benedict XIV was a completely different man than the popes who immediately preceded him. Remember, we're watching changes that are going on in society. This is a change with the church. Ignoring any kind of fight about papal rights and political authority, he turned immediately to religious and pastoral concerns. So traditionally, the popes now have been fighting with governments over who approves bishops and that sort of thing. It's basically a fight for control. This guy gives up the fight for control and goes about the job of pastoring and reestablishing that area with the church. He had great learning, great humility, and a wonderful sense of humor. He was able to deal very easily with all these people. He restored the practice of washing the feet of poor people on Holy Thursday, and he drew plans up for the revision of liturgical books. Whenever the church goes through a reform, you can tell if the reform's serious by how much they deal with the liturgy. You see, in the Catholic Church, I hate to use this analogy, but it's the one we used in the seminary. It's kind of like a dumbbell, that you have a huge circle at one end, a huge circle at the other end, and this bar. And the circle at one end is the church in its hierarchy and its clergy, its study of dogmas and morality and all this sort of stuff over here. And over here are the concerns of people, which is the morality of the family and how they're going to live the faith and everything. It's a very different thing. But you know what joins them is the liturgy. The liturgy is where the education of the celebrant impacts the lives of both the celebrant and the people. And the liturgy is where the needs and desires of the people impacts the clergy. Like, for instance, I can talk forever about sickness and all that sort of thing. It's a very different thing when I go into the room of someone who's dying who wants to receive confession and the sacraments. It's a very, very different thing. But we account it liturgically, back and forth. So liturgy, if you want to, reform the church, start with liturgy. That's exactly what Vatican II did. They began right with the liturgy. Another thing he was concerned with the list of holy days of obligation. The list of holy days of obligation is very interesting. Originally, probably the only holy day of obligation was Christmas. Easter, which is a major day, fell on Sunday every year. So the major thing was Christmas. And because the countries of Europe were Catholic, the popes noticed early that armies would stop fighting on holy days, because in Catholic thought, a holy day is the equivalent of a Sunday. You can't work if you're a soldier, fighting is your work. So wars would stop. So the church began multiplying holy days until it reached a point where, like, you can't have any wars during Lent, can't have any wars during Advent, and then these holy days are sprinkled around. It was really difficult to find a day when you could attack someone. So the church sort of played this game. But at this time, remember that the fact of the church's hold on Europe was over. So the holy days didn't quite work that way. At this time, holy days just became a burden for Catholics. And so he also wanted to revise the list of forbidden books. The list of forbidden books, incidentally, was a big thing when I was in the seminary. In fact, I'll tell you a story. There's a gentleman by the name of Teilhard de Chardin, who was a paleontologist and a Jesuit priest. And he wrote very mystically and beautifully about the relationship with God and everything, but he held strongly evolution. And so his books were condemned and on the index and this sort of thing. And at the time of Vatican II, I was in the seminary. His books were on the index. When the documents of Vatican II came out, there's sections of Vatican II you can see were actually quoted from his books. So all those bishops who were at Vatican who had obviously read the books, or they wouldn't have had the phrases and stuff that came out of him. And the church realized that sometimes, books were condemned because they didn't like the person. Like Martin Luther, particularly his early books on theology, were condemned because they didn't like Martin Luther. Some of his early books are really good. And so what the church did was re-examine this list of forbidden books because it really had become a tool that was used. So they began to re-examine that as well. Benedict was able to listen to other people and come to see things through their point of view. And I think I've mentioned this before, but if you want to be successful in working with people from a bunch of different backgrounds, you have to make a commitment to mutual comprehension. Like, I want to really understand what you're saying, and I want you to really understand what I'm saying. I do not want to convert you to my view, and of course I don't want you converting me to your view. But to the degree you can look at it, one of the things you learn in psychology is everything a person does makes sense to the one who does it. So you need to keep examining a person's reasons and everything until what they're doing makes sense. Whether you agree with it or not has nothing to do with that. But once it makes sense, then you can understand and discuss it. So what he did was listen to these things from their point of view. He maintained very, very good relationships with many enemies of the church. A good example is Voltaire, the guy who was completely opposed to any form of Christianity and brought about a lot of the problems in the French Revolution. He liked Benedict. He held him in high regard, and what he wanted basically was that Voltaire had no misunderstanding about the church's view of morality, because that's what Voltaire was looking at. So he wanted to make sure Voltaire didn't. Now, Voltaire had great respect for him. I have no idea how he felt about Voltaire, but he used to write back and forth to him as teaching, and Benedict was able to do this. His reign was a period of much political conflict. Remember I told you in the beginning, he was concentrating on religion and pastoral works? Well, there was a lot of political conflict. The reason Benedict was so successful was why that political conflict was going on. Benedict wasn't a part of it. He was interested in the pastoral area. The Papal States became a battleground for the conflict that was ensuing between Austria and Spain. Austria controlled much of Europe, and Spain was beginning to control a lot of areas too. And while the Pope protested, his main aim was to try and reconcile these two countries. Notice, Papal States are being invaded, and the main aim of the Pope is to reconcile Austria and Spain. His main purpose was not the protection of the Papal States, which is what would normally have been the thing. He remained very energetic to a very old age, and his most lasting contribution was his attention to the Vatican Library and the museums of the Vatican. Now, anyone who's ever been on a tour of the Vatican museums will remember there's art there like you'd never see in your life. You watch Raphael's and paintings by Michelangelo and statues by Michelangelo and Botticelli and all these characters. You see all this amazing art. Before this point, all this art was in the papal apartments. Now it's out for people to see. The Vatican Library, if you're a person who's interested, as I am, in scholastic work and stuff, when you step into the Vatican Library, you would swear you had died and gone to heaven. You can look at documents signed by Henry VIII when He maintained his position with regards to the marriage to Anne Boleyn. You can see letters signed by Luther sent to the Pope. You name a person in history. If they don't have something from that person in history, I don't think they matter. So they have all these ancient documents and very well preserved. This is the man who started it. Remember, 1740. He started preserving all these documents. Before, they were just in shelves in the library. And today, if you are a scholar, you can get permission to go in and go through any documents that you want. And imagine, the ability to examine the earliest manuscripts we have of all the Bible books, Just amazing collection. As a learned theologian, he helped make Rome a center of culture and enrich the museums for this purpose. He wanted to make the museums, make Rome a center of culture. And so he did that. And I think today, no one would deny that Rome is one of the great centers in the entire world of culture. If you want to educate yourself in culture, Rome probably is the very first city you would ever go to. In 1773, several of the ruling families in Europe were able to successfully pressure the Pope to suppress the Jesuits. To make the society Roman Catholic, the Jesuits often centered their ministry with important people and became themselves advisors to kings and courts. Now remember, they're very well educated. That was one of the key things to the Jesuits. And because they were so educated, important people like kings, princes, rulers, this sort of thing, wanted their children to be educated by the Jesuits. And so they would send them to Jesuit schools. Now, these people, as they rose in government, remained friends with individual Jesuits, like many of us who've been through high school or college might retain one or another teacher through the thing as a friend for the rest of our lives, or as long as they lived. And so these Jesuits were very, very influential. The Jesuit society saw that as a very specific way of re-evangelizing the Christian world, was through these leaders and stuff. And incidentally, it wasn't only the Christians. If you were to take the Jesuit, we mentioned Ricci. When Ricci was in China, Ricci is the first person of any religion other than Confucian and Buddhism that ever met the emperor. And I mean, he rose in importance and everything. It was largely because of his education. However, many rulers distrusted them because of their absolute obedience to the Pope. Okay? So important rulers began to distrust them. Like, for instance, suppose I was king of France. If I was king of France, I would have maybe a Jesuit or two that I'd known in school that were and this sort of thing. But if I was going to war with someone like Spain, well, I would notice the Spanish king also had Jesuits around here and we were advising him. And it would occur to me that the Jesuits that were advising the Spanish king and the Jesuits advising me were both interested in the Papal States rather than France or Spain. So rulers began to be very suspicious of the Jesuits. And I guess if I were to say the other thing is, there were two organizations at this time in history that amassed great fortunes, and the Jesuits were one of them. Important people would leave them their castles when they died, just great tracts of land and all kinds of things, and the others were the Knights Templar. And as a result, both the Jesuits and the Knights Templar were suppressed, and they were suppressed. The main person who worked against the Jesuits was the King of France, but in the suppression of the Jesuits, the king got all their property. And so it was an amazing thing. Same thing happened to the Knights Templar. Their property went to the rulers in their respective countries where they were suppressed. This period saw dependence on reason and sense experience with little interest in dogma or mysteries. Okay? So the idea of intent on reason, we go through the thing of reason and look at reason. I'll give you an example. It is very easy to reason to the fact that there is only one God. And the way you reason to the fact of there being only one God God has to be absolutely perfect, okay? And if two beings are absolutely perfect, they actually become one, okay? You can't have two absolutely perfect beings. There has to be only one God. So it's a very simple thing to argue through to the fact that there's only one God. You cannot argue that way with the Trinity, okay? What we would look at the Trinity is, the first thing we would say is that all through Scripture, God speaks in the plural. Let us create man in our image and likeness. Male and female, he created them. In his own image, he created them. And this whole thing, you can see there's strong argument for the notion of Trinity, and where Jesus asked, does the baptismal formula? But that's closed to them, because see, all that's dependent on dogma. You didn't start out with reason. We started out with dogma. And then, so those things sort of fell apart. The other thing that was important was sense experiences. How do you and I experience things? And a sense experience is an important thing. It very much dominates our lives, whether we know it or not. But sense experience is a very, very important thing. And I'll give you an example where you deal with it very prominently. When I was diagnosed with cancer, the doctor gave me two options. He says, we don't know how fast this develops or how it's going to go or anything like this, but we do know how to get all the cancer out of you right now. We don't know whether it will redevelop or anything, but we could get all the cancer that's in you out right now in this way. However, to do absolutely nothing would be a good experience. To have the surgery is going to be painful. So I have to make a decision. And I know in my mind, this is better for this one over here, the surgery is better for me. And I know in my body, I don't want to go through the surgery. So that's sense on both sides. And you make some kind of a decision that way. But sense experiences became very, very important, much more important than dogma and mysteries. There was little respect for the contemplative life, which was the idea of sitting and meditating. And there was an acceptance of orders dedicated to works of charity. So if you would look at an order like the Camaldolese, who spend their life in prayer and meditation and stuff like that, the principal benefits an order like that brings to the church is that many of them are spiritual directors to a lot of other people. So their spirituality spreads out that way. And many of them are authors, both of music and treatise on theology and stuff like that. And they contribute that to the church. But do you realize that in what we were talking about, that has a much more to do with this whole idea of dogma and stuff like that than it does with other things. So what they thought the monks and everything were useless. And so we see that sort of disintegrate. On the other hand, if you have an order like the Jesuits that are teachers, if you have an order like the Dominicans that preach, if you order like the Franciscans who take care of the poor, all of these can be seen as useful. And so they were very, very big deal. But anything that was really contemplative sort of fell away. And if you were to look at the Benedictine order, if you were to take the Camaldolese, which are probably the most contemplative, they're a Benedictine order. And if you were to take the priests and brothers who run different colleges, Benedictine colleges, they're the Benedictine order too. But at this time in history, they would not want the monastery, but they would want the college. And so this was a very strange time. There was a huge fear of an order which taught people and was so firmly tied to the Pope. So the Jesuits, while they were teachers, they felt they were too closely tied to the Pope. It's really funny because you and I live in a country, the United States, where we see a division between the church and the state. So there are many things the Pope will ask us to do in our lives with regards to mass attendance and fasting, and we have all these things that come from the Pope. Not one of them is geared that the Pope should own the country. That's not what he's about at all, okay? And in today's world, it's pretty well that way. No one thinks the religion itself is trying to take over a country. And so, but this time, they were very worried that the Pope, who was a political leader as well as a religious leader, would work to take over countries. So the Jesuits were expelled from Portugal first, but it was closely followed by Spain, Naples, and the lands ruled by the members of the Bourbon family. And that's the different countries that were under French rule, as well as France itself. Under pressure from the enemies of the Jesuits, the Pope suppressed the order and ordered them to disband. So the Jesuits, their Jesuit houses were closed, and the order was disbanded. Most who were priests became parish priests, and just diocesan priests. But some fled to non-Catholic countries like Russia and Prussia. And the thing that was really interesting is that Russia, now remember, Russia is a Russian Orthodox country. At this point in history, is actually ruled by a woman who was born and baptized Lutheran, which was Catherine the Great in Russia was born German. So she was Lutheran by her background, but she was head of this Russian Orthodox country. The Jesuits were preserved in there and in Prussia, and it's because of their amazing education ability. Prussia was mainly Lutheran. So there are two countries that are not Catholic, but we can thank them for the preservation of the Jesuits. Pope Clement XIV hoped that this would help relationships with the ruling families, but as it turned out, it didn't. It in no way helped his relationship with those families. The loss of the Jesuits was incalculable as far as how it affected the church. Missions and schools all over the world were closed down, as well as many other monasteries, other ministries in which the Jesuits had been involved. And we would know that, I've mentioned this before, but if you go through South America, you see all those great churches and everything were built. The missionary work in South America was done almost entirely by Jesuits. When the Jesuits were suppressed, their missionary work was overtaken by Dominicans and Franciscans. And they had moved through South America and were in the process of moving north, and they were changed just at the time they entered California. So it's Franciscans that came up here. But these would have been Jesuit missions had the Jesuits been allowed to go on. In Germany and England, there were many important books written about theories with regards to education and religion. One of the things they wanted to do was to try, remember Germany and England are non-Catholic countries at this point, they wanted to acquire the benefits of Catholic education. And I think we know that Catholic education is an amazing thing. I'll give you an interesting example. When I was in India, one of the things that was pointed out to me, the Indian legislature in the country of India oftentimes passes laws that are not helpful to the church. They are really, they would like to preserve it as a Hindu country, but they don't want to outlaw a religion. I don't think they do that. But what they do is they do things that at times are kind of hindrant to the Catholic. There is not a single person in the parliament in India whose children are not in a Catholic school. Not one. And it's this idea, that is our thing, education. Jesus said to the apostles, go forth and teach all nations. By God, we've done that. Teaching is our thing. And so these books about the theories of education and religion were the efforts really to try and get the theories and the practices which were behind the excellent Catholic education and pull it into secular schools. This was the flowering of the Enlightenment in these two countries. Remember, the Enlightenment has to do with reasoning, so they look into these things and try and reason them. I'm going through a list now of sort of Enlightenment people, much as we did the Protestant thing. John Locke in England said that the human mind was a clean slate at birth, and experiences filled the slate, a theory that is today rejected. Okay? The term for a clean slate is called a tabula rasa. It's like a blackboard with nothing on it, a blank plate. And then experiences begin to make that. You realize that's not true. When we're born, there's certain things that are born instinctually. Food, protection. There are a lot of things that are very animalistic that are brought into us. The second thing is we're specifically taught many things by people. Our parents teach us certain things, schools teach us certain things, so many things are taught. The thing that I find is that as you get older, your teachings become tested by your experiences. So you're taught certain things, and as you go on in your life, you find other things work, and you find some things you were taught didn't work. So experience, to me, is like the great testing ground. I call experience is the laboratory of education. We educate ourselves and learn all of this, but experience tells us what to keep and what to dump, okay? Society was the result of a conflict between free and equal individuals, okay? Now, by conflict, he doesn't mean a fist fight, okay? He says free individuals of opposite views are the ones that, produce a good society. And I'll give you a very good example of that. An example of that's Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln became president, he picked specific enemies who had fought him very seriously during his campaign to be president and put them on his cabinet. And what he expected was that in the speaking of their views and the speaking of his views, together they could resolve and make a much better society. And they did. They did. But it's very important, remember I told you earlier, the ability to understand what the other person's saying. So if you fully understand why I hold what I hold, and I know why you hold what you hold, we can have an intelligent discussion with mutual respect and come to a middle ground. That's the way our country was founded. This man, Locke, promoted checks and balances in government and taught that ethics was more important than dogma. And the Catholic Church, I think we would teach that what you do is dependent on what you believe. Ethics is very important because that's what we see and how we act. But our ethics or our morality is really dependent on what we believe. Do I honestly believe that all human beings are equal? Then that's going to affect the way I act. If I don't believe that, then it's going to come out in the way I act. And actions, much better than my words, will tell you what I actually believe. And so he taught that. This idea of checks and balances, I think you know that right now in our country, I don't mean this to be a political thing at all, but right now in our country, a lot of the checks and balances are not working because people have been appointed to check who were part of the other side. So like, for instance, the head of the EPA used to be an oil executive. Now, you'd really want the Environmental Protection Agency to be someone who's going to be cautious about things that can hurt the environment. And so anyway, in our country right now, this doesn't work. But the key is, like Lincoln, the key is you pick people of other points of view so that you have many points of view working together to arrive at what is right, rather than, just enforcing any one point of view. I don't care how good it is. If all it is enforced, it eventually is corrupted, okay? He did retain the idea that Jesus was God. Voltaire felt that Locke's vision of Christianity was really a new religion, okay? Because Locke took Jesus and the teachings of Jesus and saw them as really, really wonderful and did away with any of the dogma of the whole thing. And to give you an example of another person who did that, and it's actually reflected in the documents in the United States, is Thomas Jefferson. If you ever go to Monticello, you can see Jefferson's Bible. And Jefferson has a Bible in which he's cut out all the miracles and all the, what I would call spacey teaching. And all he has is the morality, love your neighbor, do this, do that, do the other thing. But he's cut out all the miracles. And what he has done is taken what we would call a religious morality, and he's brought out an ethic, a very good ethic. But you can look at Jesus as an ethicist. It's not as full as Jesus as a moralist, but he is a strong ethicist. You could look at it that way. Now, a man from Scotland was David Hume. He was a philosopher and a historian, and may have had the sharpest mind of any of the other people in the Enlightenment. He was a very clear writer on many subjects, but on religion and philosophy, he was actually radical. So notice he is radical in his teaching, and the most dangerous people are the people who are clear. Okay? Now, if you listen to someone give an explanation, it's very complex and stuff, you may like it, you may think it's a good talk, but it's gone. But if you clearly understand it, then it takes place in you. That's why I said again, if you want to have this sort of thing, what you want to do is come to understand the other person's point of view. And this understanding allows the teachings to settle in us, if you want. He taught that reason should be the servant of our passions. Now, if you notice, most of the other guys in the Enlightenment taught passions were bad. You shouldn't feel like this sort of thing, that reason, the whole thing's guided by reason. But he thought that reason was actually the servant of our passions. Our minds were a bundle of sense impressions, those are passions, based on the conclusions we'd reached about our world, and should not be based on religious belief, but on reason and provable argument. Okay? A perfect enlightenment. Perfect enlightenment. Everything should be reason, everything else gone. In Germany, there was a man known by Gottfried Leibniz, and he wanted to find a way to reconcile divine realities with the human struggle. See, human life is, as we know, a struggle. It's a struggle in the way we survive. It's struggle with other people, at times struggle with government. But human life is a series of struggles. Struggles physically, mentally, spiritually. It's an ongoing thing of struggles. And so he wanted to find a way to reconcile divine realities with the human struggle. It's really interesting that he's someone in the Enlightenment doing this, because that's what you find in the Catholic Church in contemplative life. So like if you go to the Camaldolese or the Carmelites, they have integrated this whole human struggle with the realities of God. They stand before, they integrate them. And although he was not very well known during the Enlightenment, Leibniz is a really big name today. It'd be interesting to speculate on the percentage of doctoral theses presented at universities in our own day that deal with Leibniz. When I was in the university, there were lots of papers being written on Leibniz from many different ways. And another one at this time comes from Germany, Immanuel Kant. He taught that the age of reason brought the human race to adulthood, okay? So he believed that the human race is moving in a certain way, and with the age of enlightenment, we entered adulthood, where we deal with reasoning and stuff like this. I think one of the really curious things when you study history, almost everyone in history that I've studied thinks that their age is the end of history, so that people have risen to their highest and all this sort of thing. I may have shared with you before a story about Teilhard de Chardin, who was giving a lecture in New York, and at the end of the lecture, a young lady asked a question. Teilhard de Chardin was the man who taught evolution, and asked a question about the amazing qualities concerned with how all of creation had come together in producing this. And Teilhard de Chardin stopped her and he said, "Listen, if we were the end of evolution, God would not have bothered." What he wanted to get across is we're a stage in where this is going on. The end of evolution is Jesus Christ. That is the perfect human, okay? If we all end up like Jesus, we will have arrived. Till then, we got to keep moving, okay? People needed the courage to think for themselves and to use reason correctly. And the inquiring of knowledge would lead to a better and more peaceful world. okay? This is one of the big things that came out of the Enlightenment. And if you look at the history of the United States, that you almost watch that the Age of Enlightenment greatly influenced our documents, but you watch that the Age of Enlightenment has enabled us to accept immigrants. Sometimes it's kind of slow. Like, for instance, right now there's sort of a strange look at the Hispanics coming into the country. But if you know history, exactly that look was at the Irish when they began the immigrants, and then at the Italians when they began the immigration. And the whole thing is that our documents allow us in this country to assimilate and grow and create peace rather than have to resolve these things with conflict. And the stuff is there. But that's because of this acquiring of knowledge and stuff. Religion was a matter of seeing duty as the command of God, and conscience gave people everything they needed to know. Okay? So this idea of seeing duty as the command of God, that's kind of strange to us, but that is more German than a kilt is Scottish. This idea of duty. I don't know how many of you have ever visited Germany. The sense of duty is staggering. If there's a piece of paper on the sidewalk, no one passes it. I have no idea how it got there, but the first person who sees it will pick it up. If you get on their buses were huge, long things that are separated in the middle, so it's almost like a train. And the driver of the bus is in a glass cage in the very first car. And where you pay when you get on the bus is at the very end of the last car. And you watch every single person gets on and puts their money in. If someone gets on and doesn't and sits down, everyone looks at them, and they suddenly realize they've forgotten and they go put the money in. It's just that. I think in the United States, someone would get on, break that thing, take the money, and get off, but not in Germany. It's all duty, okay? So this, he says, divine revelation and a redeemer were unnecessary and impossible. So there's no reason for God to tell us anything, and there's no reason for us to be redeemed. We have to be educated, okay? And again, I think when you look at these people, they're all right from their point of view. We do need to be educated, but that isn't all. We do need to have religion, but that isn't all. We do need, and all these things, each one, it's as though a big understanding of a specific point is given to each individual. Scientific theories and understandings were bringing about many new and important inventions that were changing people's lives. And the way of life, as they knew it, was changing to an entirely different view. And what we watch now, the church has begun to turn away from political things to more religious things. Science is turning away from religion to more reasoning and this sort of thing. And this way of working, living in cities is growing as away from the country. The entire world is going through probably the most radical sociological change history has ever seen. I think it's more important here than actually is the Industrial Revolution, but then this will lead up to the Industrial Revolution. Now we're looking at a group of people whose scientific discoveries or scientific opinions really affected this world at this time. The first one is Isaac Newton. He published a report on his laws for gravitation and motion, and he offered a new and clearer view of the universe. Many people began to think about the universe as a well-made machine, okay? So now Isaac Newton looks at the universe and finds out it operates by laws. God doesn't send a comet to scare us to death. A comet comes by every certain time. Okay, so all these laws of the thing, the whole thing, and then the danger of this is that they come out of it is we are living in a perfectly operating machine, okay? Once you put together this concept of perfectly operating machine, you watch scientists in our own day deal with the random. There is just something random in the universe. Nobody knows what it is yet, but there's something random in the universe. And you can have a law work all this time this way, and one day it just doesn't apply, and then it's back in force again. Really strange things. But anyway, so he saw it this way. He saw that once God created it, he left the universe to run on its own, and people became so interested that they were not interested in the creator, though God was always important to Newton, okay? It's interesting, some of these deeply religious men, we're going to see another one is Darwin. Darwin was deeply religious. His father was a minister, and yet their views came to be used oftentimes very irreligiously by different people. But the result of Newton maintained there was a creator that put together all this stuff and everything, but the concept of the creator was lost. It's as though the machine existed on its own. And his worldview was actually shared by Leibniz, whom we mentioned earlier, and by Descartes, who is another philosopher. Descartes is the one who started with pure reason. He began with, he says, I have to prove first that I exist. And once I prove that I exist, then I began. The way he proved he existed is because he thinks. He says, if I think, I am, okay? So he would go on with that and then developed his whole thing from that. Important discoveries of this time were oxygen and how electricity worked. People were beginning to understand the relationship between heat and energy. Scientists began to develop much more precise tools for measuring that added greatly to their experiments, and new inventions multiplied as the period progressed. And while we're talking about tools for measuring, it's tools for measuring heat, for instance, how hot, how cold something is. Tools for measuring how fast something moves, this sort of thing. I don't mean like a tape measure for a wall, but measuring all kinds of things that were very elusive in the ancient world. And you would have, if you go back into Greek or Egyptian physics, you'll find that they will speak of measurements and they're never exact. They're sort of well about and this sort of thing. And I think you know you can't operate science that way. So he's one of the big things at this time was the development of measurements. John Kay invented a new way to speed up the weaving of cloth. This will be very important because when we go into the United States, in the United States, we produced cotton. In England, using these weaving things, England created cloth. And then through the rest of the world, England sold cloth. And so part of slavery is tied to that. Shipping is tied to that. Commerce is tied to that. So this invention of a new way to weave was very important. James Watt developed a steam engine, and this set the Industrial Revolution off and running. Okay, so with the arrival of the steam engine, we had an energy-producing thing other than a human being or an animal. And having an energy-producing thing, then we began to harness it for everything. Scotland and England joined to form Great Britain, 1707, and became the most powerful country in Europe. They ruled the 13 American colonies and Canada. And while England was Anglican and Scotland Presbyterian, in Ireland and in Canada, the Catholics were in the majority. Roman Catholics were now an insignificant minority in the British Empire, and most lived in rural areas near the homes of Catholic gentlemen who would have a chaplain who lived on the estate. and he would celebrate sacraments in secret. There were no Catholic churches, nothing public. Near the end of the 1700s, hostility towards Catholics began to lessen in England. And the real hostility of Catholics stems from a plot to destroy the Parliament buildings that took place not long after the break of England from the church. And so the Catholics were viewed as hostile, and that's what brought about the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic, and these people. But this hostility at this point began to lessen. In Scotland, Catholics often suffered greatly, and many of them went to North America and settled in an area called Nova Scotia, which means New Scotland. So they went up there. I should mention my own ancestors left Scotland, Presbyterians at the time, left Scotland and came to the United States. The principal work that the Scottish people who came to the New World did was trade in furs. So the Native Americans would hunt and gather beaver, buffalo, and that sort of thing. And around the area of the Hudson Bay, the Scottish traders would come in and collect these things and then take them normally to Quebec City. And then from Quebec City, then they moved out to be taken to Europe, okay? But the Scottish were very strong in the United States, in North America rather, with the fur trade. In Ireland, the Catholics were ruled with an iron hand. It's, while the Catholics were very hated and everything in England, they never went through a persecution like they did in Ireland. Ireland was the worst persecution that ever took place in a civilized area. Their lands were taken away from Catholics, and they had absolutely no voice in public life. Men and women in religious orders were expelled, and there were strict rules governing all priests. In the north, there was no persecution for the Protestants. So in Northern Ireland, a lot of Protestants had settled up there. And when the religious persecutions came into Ireland, the Protestants were not persecuted, just the Catholics in the land. It was a time of terrible persecution for the church. In the 18th century, changes began to take place in Catholic Ireland. In 1782, permission was given for the building of churches. It's really funny, if you visit Ireland today, you go into a town and there's usually a magnificent church in there, and you go in and the pews and everything are missing. I don't know where they ever had them. And they maybe have 20 chairs, and it's a Church of Ireland church, which is the Church of England branch in Ireland. And then you'll find a smaller church, a Catholic church. That's where everyone goes. There may be a couple of Catholic churches and stuff like this, but the big, beautiful churches in Ireland, even where St. Patrick is buried, are all Church of Ireland, okay? One of the things that, I don't know whether we'll cover that today, but one of the agreements the Catholic Church made was when they were given their freedom, they would not try and reclaim the lands that were taken away, okay? Church did the same thing in France. When you visit the great cathedrals like Notre Dame belongs to the French government. Now they allow the Catholics to be there and to say Mass and everything, but all these old great churches in France, England and stuff like this, these were all left. The church made no effort to get them back, which is, the church's people, not the buildings anyway, so who cares? In 1790, religious freedom was granted, and in 1795, the seminary at Maynooth was opened. Maynooth Seminary is a very, very prominent and powerful seminary. And I want you to know that Maynooth has had a huge influence on the United States. That I would say that when I was a young boy entering the seminary, probably maybe half the bishops in the United States were graduates of Maynooth. The situation in Canada was very different. Canada was a French colony and served by the Jesuits, Franciscans, and Capuchins. And the Catholic Church had very strong roots there. The Sisters of Charity were established in Quebec, and while the British tried initially to turn Quebec into a Protestant city, Canadian Catholics resisted strongly. Under the leadership of Archbishop Plessis, the first Archbishop of Quebec, the French were forced in 1774 to grant freedom, the British were forced in 1774 to grant freedom of religion. It's very interesting to think about this, that with the percentage of Catholics in French Canada, the British were unable to have the persecution, and yet there was a higher percentage in Ireland, and they did. I don't know whether it was because they were so much closer to England itself or whatever, but the Irish Catholics suffered like no other people did at the time. So basically Canada was accepted, French Canada was accepted as Catholic, and were allowed to practice the faith. And Canada, the government of Canada is much like our own in the idea of the freedom of religion, the separation of church and state, and stuff like that. So why don't we stop there? And next time we're going to continue on the effects of the Enlightenment and how this alters church for the coming history. Thank you very much.